Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
This is our final episode about the 2023 Oscar nominees. And today we're talking about achievement in prop mastering. Now, listeners who follow the Academy Awards closely may be asking themselves, what are they on about? Props aren't recognized as an Oscar category. On that point, you'd be right. However, I'm going to posit that this is a grave injustice. And so today I've invited some guests to talk about which of last year's films would be worthy of a hypothetical nomination for the work of the property master. As with all of our episodes in this series, my guests bring expertise. Gregg Bilson Jr., you're the president of the ISS Group, a conglomerate of companies that make, sell, and rent props around the world. Gregg, welcome back to Below the Line.
Thanks for having me.
Also returning is Scott Buckwald, property master and friend of the show. Scott, your credits include The Old Man, The Prestige, and A Mighty Wind. Glad to have you back as well.
Always a pleasure, Robert.
Now, you can't call me Robert. People are not going to know who that is. You got to call me Skid.
Skid. Okay.
Okay. If you want to learn more about my guests or any of the prop masters we discuss, go to imdb.com. Below the Line has a page where I notate every episode, and it's easy to click through to the resumes of my guests. Let's get into it. The 2023 prop mastering nominees, as selected by us, are The Creator, Last Voyage of the Demeter, Napoleon, Oppenheimer, and Poor Things. We're going to discuss them in that order, and spoilers are possible, so consider this awarding. Apologies in advance if I mispronounce the names of any prop masters, and my guests know they're welcome to correct me, which makes them equally culpable. Okay, first up, The Creator, property master Justin Hazelden.
This was a movie that certainly wasn't one of my favorite movies, though I was extremely impressed by it. The movie itself seemed like it was trying to redo the Terminator movies. Definitely had that feel, even had a feel of a movie that would have come out in the 90s. Certainly the CGI and the technology of the movie is far greater than what would have come out in the 90s. But overall, I did enjoy the movie. But it's creating a world. There's different levels of propping, and I know that I've done several of them. There's the kind of propping where you essentially can just go to a prop house and pull things off the shelf and bring them directly to the set. This movie, which a lot of sci-fi movies have and a lot of horror movies have, you're creating things. There's very little that is going to be directly off the shelf. And even though the movie itself might not fall into the same category critically as, say, Oppenheimer, as a prop master looking at the movie, I'm seeing it on a whole different level.
Yeah, I would agree with Scott. They created an entire world that didn't previously exist, and I thought it was a very interesting mix of very high-tech, sophisticated technology and then very lowbrow technology with simple farming in the land in which they used. The story wasn't my favorite either, and it's probably why it fell flat at the box office. But visually, the design, the ships, the weaponry, the existence that they created in this otherwise never seen before world was beautiful. I mean, it was very attractive to watch. And really, that's what sucked me in. The talent was also very good. It's just the story for me didn't really resonate, and apparently for others as well, because at the box office, it did seem to struggle.
I think part of the reason it struggled, I know my favorite movie partner for this kind of stuff is my son. And on the first time we saw the trailers for this movie, our initial reaction was, this is just Terminator. And I think to modern audiences, they feel like they've either seen the movie before or it just didn't strike a nerve that would have struck people 20 years ago. But, again, nothing in this movie existed. Everything has to be created. Everything has to be designed. That's what always impresses me, because I know on the smallest level, on small movies that I've done, small TV shows that I've done, even if I only have one or two creative things, sometimes just creating a rubber knife is much more than most people would imagine it's going to take to do that. And then when you look at a movie like this, it it's staggering, and I'm very impressed by the work that the prop master would have done for this movie.
Yeah, agreed.
Were there specific props that maybe they took it in a direction that you thought you wouldn't expect for a futuristic film, or was there just the general challenge of doing a future set film impressed you?
Well, I think on futuristic genre, to me, is the most difficult prop job there is, because you really have to think through what is the technology going to be 100 years, 200 years in advance? What things remain the same? So you're really picking and choosing your battles as far as what technological leaps and jumps there are. They had a space element here. They had weaponry. They had vehicles. They had some pretty sophisticated technology. And I thought they went down that path pretty intelligently. There was nothing in this that stood out to me, and that's my line in the sand. Is like nothing stood out. It's like, oh my God, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. They would have done this, they would have done that. So to me, when a job is done very well, you're never taken out of the moment for them telling the story. I never really felt out of the moment for this particular project.
What impresses me about this genre of movies, if you look back on older filmmaking, now I understand what we have available to us to create and build now far surpasses what existed in previous generations, but the movie was consistent. If you look at older sci-fi, and I mean sci-fi like from the 50s, it sometimes you could see modern weapons, and I know it sounds goofy where they just took a modern weapon and maybe put a piece of aluminum foil on it, or they might have created one thing, but then there was anachronisms all through the movie of various time periods. And probably wasn't until maybe Planet of the Apes and 2001 Space Odyssey where sci-fi started becoming sophisticated for grown-ups. When I watched this movie, like Greg said, nothing ever took me out of the element. Everything about it seemed like they went to this time period and propped it from then. Every prop seemed organic to the movie. Every prop seemed like it was the correct evolution from where it came. I remember they were making their versions of AK-47s, and I was impressed by it because it looked like an AK, but it looked like an AK several generations into the future. And that was something that caught my eye simply because it's something that I personally would have to deal with. But in general, I thought the movie was very consistent and very just on top of things.
Well, the next film on our list is a different kind of challenge. That's The Last Voyage of the Demeter, Property Master Eklund Frizz.
Another gorgeous film. There was a lot of night sequences shot on this. And anytime you film on, near, or around water and a boat, it's a very difficult environment in which to shoot. You're in small spaces, you're constantly moving. And then once again, everything in this project, granted, people have been sailing for many hundreds of years, but everything was created. The ship, not one single element you could go down to Walmart and buy. Everything had to be created, and many aspects had to be technically accurate with regard to the historical time period in which you were doing this. And then the actors, the set, it all has to operate. You all have to work within this environment, 150 years behind. And once again, this was gorgeous. Nothing stood out. Everything was very much the same theme, the same tone, the same textures and colors, and everything I thought was really very good.
See, I would say the exact same thing. In a lot of ways, this movie was the opposite side of the coin from the creator. It takes place in the past. It's a created story. It didn't really happen. Total fantasy. I think the movie did not do well at the box office because I think it missed its mark in certain ways. I personally don't think it took it as far as it could have, but the consistency of everything from the production design to the hair and makeup, to the costumes, to the props, it all worked well. And it's great when that happens, when you could see that all of these people worked together on one level or the other, and every prop had to be created. Little difference between this and the creator is this, they had guidelines, whether it was weapons or various tools used on the sailing ship. They had references, but again, to be able to recreate it is a lot of work, and it's not doesn't make it necessarily easier to do it. In some ways, it makes it harder because you're having to live up to people's expectations. But just all around beautiful movie. I loved every piece of it.
Are you saying that you don't believe in vampires?
Um, the movie, I was hoping the movie, this is more critical on the movie. I was hoping the movie was going to have more of a feel of Aliens, and it never reached that level of horror to me.
Yeah.
Totally different discussion, I know. And the props could have been the same whether it was the movie I wanted to see or this movie.
Yeah, I'm always blown away with the volume of work that needs to happen to fully put you in this environment. Some of those seaside villages, they're loading up the ship, the horse-drawn carriages, the horses. These are all things that property masters deal with and creating that entire environment. And like Scott was saying, it's also the position of property master. Not only do they collaborate artistically with the art department, with the decoration, with the costumes and wardrobe, but they're also working directly with the talent to utilize all of these components so their performance is as genuine as the look of the project. And if the property master does the wrong job, even something as simple as drinking grog or having a meal below deck or just anything, if they don't do their job correctly, the performance is directly impacted. We have to keep them in the moment as well for this time period.
Good. Something you said, Greg, just made me think of something. The dividing line in my career between having done low budget things and to where I finally started to feel like I came into my own was when I started having a budget to deal with the background. And very often, and you just really struck something with me now. If you look at a movie like Raiders of the Lost Ark, everyone's going to think of his whip and certain hero props, and those are the things that are going to end up in the Smithsonian. Those are the things that the film people make recreations of and going to try to sell on eBay. But when I look at some of the movies I've done, it is a lot more work sometimes to have to put something in the hands of all of the people walking up and down the street, things that create the world. And very little attention and guidance is given to me for that. A lot of first ADs are happy if I just give everybody briefcases and shopping bags and call it a day, which has always been a little bit of a raw nerve for me because I don't do briefcases and shopping bags. I'll always try to take pictures of, for present day shows, what's going on in the background and just try to make background come alive. But it really is a job unto itself. And in a movie like Last Voyage, if you're watching, like what Greg was saying, along the docks, everybody is doing something. And everything that's in anyone's hand took as much work and recreation as any of the foreground hero props.
Yeah, agreed. And unfortunately, the only time a property master gets a lot of notoriety is when it's done wrong, because it stands out like a sore thumb. But when it's done very well, all the nuances are captured perfectly. Nobody even thinks about it because it was just all done perfectly.
I believe, Greg, you would know, Jerry Moss did Private Ryan, correct?
No, Jerry Moss was not the property master on Saving Private Ryan. There were numerous property masters, but one of the primary people was Maxie McDonald. And the primary aspect of that was the guns, and that was Simon Atherton out of the UK. And that big opening sequence with all the guns and the insane made you feel like you were with Tom Hanks when they were storming the beach at Normandy. Steven Spielberg, before production even began, had us ISS videotape all the weapons that would be used in that battle to see what the extraction of the shells looked like, what the impact and jolt looked like when they were shooting. And he wanted to make sure that there were no jams that would take place, so they didn't have to stop that big 10-minute scene. And what they ultimately determined is that real jams happened with real weapons in real battles. So he taught the actors in the background and the stunts how to clear them, and they just kept going. It just added to the insanity of war when you're being shot at. So it was just one of those things that a prop person does to work with production to add additional realism. So most people that saw that movie felt as though, to a certain aspect, they've actually been through a war. That's how well that scene was shot.
That's probably a good segue to the third film on our list, Napoleon, property master Joshua Pauly.
When I saw Napoleon, I immediately thought back to Private Ryan and exactly what Greg said. I have been a movie fan from the time I was a little boy. And, when I was a kid, my mother was my favorite movie partner. Now it's my son. And I've always allowed myself to get lost in a great movie. And now, having been working in film all of my adult life, I don't watch a movie thinking there's 150 people on the other side of that, and that none of these people are getting hurt. When I see a good movie, I fall into it. And all through Napoleon, I'm watching the trailer now. Every little weapon, every little thing, it just let me walk away thinking this is what it would have been like if I was on that battlefield.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, modern war is one thing, but war back then was just absolutely heinous. A little flesh wound, you would die 3, 6, 8, 10 weeks down the road.
Right.
All the battle scenes, the cannons, the food, the luxury in which these people lived in at the time period in which they were doing it, the combination of costumes and the set designs, it was just a gorgeous film to look at. And you're almost under a little additional pressure because you're recreating historical events that took place. These are real people. These were real events. And to portray them both accurately and then tell the story without ever coming out of that moment is much more difficult than people know.
And once again, I think the devil is in the details, and the details are certainly in a lot of the background. I'm watching now, there's a little bit of a making of, and I see Ridley Scott walking, basically inspecting the troops. Every one of them is fully equipped. They have a gun. None of that is CGI. Maybe the deep background they started CGIing, but again, as a prop professional, I know the amount of work that took just to procure all of those weapons.
Yeah, I agree. And Ridley Scott is an amazing filmmaker, but also just how they did battle back then is different than the way they do battle now.
Yeah.
The way they hold a weapon, the way they would hold their ground, everything has to be done correctly. And then your background, even though they look perfect, if they don't act perfect and are given the correct direction, the whole thing is lost. You can have an amazing vintage everything, but it was done with a more modern warfare that was not done, and the historians would tear that apart.
One thing that I always take a lot of pride in is I really enjoy the research end of it. I don't always want to just yield to their tech advisor. I try to bring myself up to speed, especially when I've done period films, to be that tech advisor. I went to school for history. It's something that comes naturally to me. And it is a service as the prop master that I really love being able to offer. And there's an attitude that they have to hold the weapons with. There's so many preconceived notions of what history was like, and you have to watch for the actors not to be doing that. It's quite an undertaking, and I'm looking at Napoleon, and I'm like, I just cannot praise the prop master enough for just such an amazing job, well done, just knowing what obstacles they had in front of them.
Yeah, and for those that aren't aware, just utilizing black powder anything on a film set a reset for take two is a giant pain in the ass. There's nothing simple about it. I mean, you got to keep your powder dry. You have to flit properly. There's so many different aspects. And then they're running around with these guns that could go bang at any time with a giant sticky bayonet. I mean, there's so many aspects of this that are terrifying. And then you add several hundred people into the mix. It's just the amount of work that went into every one of those days on this project. I bet those people slept really well at the end of the day, that they worked their butts off.
These kind of movies, the scope of the work is as impressive as the individual pieces that a prop master has to put together. And you'll always focus on the main things. You'll focus on the goblets that they're using, the period eyeglasses, a book, a piece of paper, the writing instruments they're using, the weapons, obviously in Napoleon. But then the other part is, for everything they had to get, they probably had to get another 150 of them. And as hard as it is to get 150, sometimes it just seems unsurmountable when you're first opening the script and you're reading it and you're thinking, how in the world am I going to pull this off? But we always do. And this person definitely did.
And then not just when the cameras are there, but how about when they wrap at night? Everything has to go back and get cleaned and then get ready to do it all again the next day. And sometimes you're having to do that multiple days in a row. And maybe one day it's raining and now you're doing all these things in the mud and it has to match. I mean, when you look at all the elements that they have to fight through to make it happen as well as they did, I'm just blown away at the scope and the scale and how well this was done.
On the show I'm working on now, not to give a spoiler on something that hasn't been completed yet, but we have a battle scene. And originally, the ADs our assistant directors, had scheduled the after effect of the battle scene before the battle scene. And between myself and the stunt coordinator, we spoke to them and we said, that's not the way we want to do this. Let's do it in the right order so that we don't have to worry about pre-breaking things. Let's break things in the shot. Let's not have to spend time and money on creating the destruction, when if we shoot the scene in a continuity order, in the right order, a lot of that destruction will happen naturally.
Now you're giving away all the secrets, Scott.
Yeah.
Yeah, Scott, if you want to give away secrets about Old Man, you're welcome to do so here. We're big fans of that show coming back, so keep it coming.
I am a big fan of that show as well. And that's one of the great things about sitting in my seat at ISS, is that oftentimes I get to read the scripts and then I get to see what they ultimately did. And I geek out on all this stuff. When it's done well, it's just, there's nothing better.
Yesterday, I was working weapons with Jeff Bridges and handling it professionally, and it was great. But there's a little voice inside of me that's going, oh, yay, this is so cool. Because to myself, I'm like this 12-year-old boy thinking, I'm giving guns to Jeff Bridges. I can't get over I'm doing this. And I think in this business, because the hours are so long and the work can be so arduous at times, if we could stay excited. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and there's a lot of guys my age looking to retire, and I have zero interest in retiring. I am having such a blast. Every time I walk into Gregg's office, I have fun. I love walking through ISS. I get a kick of seeing all of the things that are available to me. I would find it hard to believe with a movie like Napoleon or Last Voyage of the Demeter or The Creator that those prop masters do not love what they're doing.
We talked about the challenges of these large battle scenes. The next film's got a different kind of challenge, and that's Oppenheimer, property master Guillaume Deluche. And in fact, I know Guillaume. He was an assistant props back on Swordfish when I was working in LA. We done a couple of things together when I was out there. So Guillaume, congratulations for your nomination. But what was it about Oppenheimer that you guys thought was worthy of a props nomination?
Well, once again, you're recreating historical events that took place. And in Oppenheimer, for me, they gave you a view behind what was taking place on a large global scale with the race of this atomic energy and this atomic capabilities. to potentially impact wars that were taking place. And then the politics and some of the behind the scenes stuff that you got to see with, do we really go forward with this technology? The politics involved in it was really fascinating to me. And once again, it's period. I mean, we had people like Einstein and Oppenheimer and all of these crazy people involved in what really took place. And we know how it ends. To me, when you make a film and you know the ending, and yet they still capture your attention for the entire 3+ hours, it's done very well.
Having worked with Christopher Nolan, one thing I could say about having worked with him is you will not hear the expression, "Don't worry about it, no one will notice," on his set. That if there's a particular insignia that needs to go on the chest of one of the officers, and the movie is taking place in 1944, May of 1944, and you find out that that insignia changed a little bit in April of 44, he's going to want the right one. It's great having the bar set so high, because when you complete it, it as much of a torture as it might be sometimes during it, boy, when you sit back and watch it, you just love the praises that people put upon you. And everything about this movie, again, I know how, just like what Gregg said, I knew how it was going to end, but the journey getting there was just fantastic.
Yeah, and then this had a lot of interesting elements, everything from press of the time period, very sophisticated, top secret science and medical devices that a lot of people had never seen before. It was very difficult to recreate these items for Guillaume, the decorator, the entire art department on this project. I felt as though I was in that time period going through the entire process with everybody. And like we've said on numerous occasions, when a film is done at a very high level, it takes you, you're living in that environment. You're being told the story and you're almost part of it. You're never taken out of it if it's done well. Everybody, the actors, the props, to me, a prop is an actor that doesn't speak or do anything, but it's just as relevant to have you in that moment.
One thing I say when I interview for a movie is that I consider myself an actor in the show, and that as a grown man, if I'm doing a show with a bunch of teenagers, I have to be a 17-year-old. I can't give those kids a backpack that appeals to me. I have to create, I have to become those characters. You have to get into the heads of all of those people. On The Old Man, anything I give Jeff Bridges, whether it's a wallet or a set of keys, it has to be natural to him. And as easy as it is, because this show is present day, I can go on Amazon and just buy a wallet, but it has to be the right wallet. And then when you look at a show and you take that into consideration for Oppenheimer, that not only did you have to do all of that, but it had to match the time period as well. Again, I'm looking at clips and I'm looking at as they're viewing the atomic blasts, they're all wearing their safety goggles. And Gregg, I don't know if ISS had to recreate those, but I'm sure they did not find those in the wild and just purchase them. They might have found a couple of them to use as reference if they were lucky enough, but
I believe he had all that made through his optics people. But you brought up a really great point. Oftentimes when we're doing a project like Napoleon or Oppenheimer or any of these vintage things, even The Last Voyage, these aren't period films. So everything that you're putting on a film set has to be contemporary for that time period. So even though it may be 150 years old or 60 years old or 70 years old, it has to be brand new. It has to be functioning. It has to look like it isn't 75 years old or 100 years old. And to find that, good luck. And then if you have to create it, even tougher, because you may not have the budget, you may not have the time period, you may not have all the research. It's a lot more work than anybody has any idea.
Yeah, it really is such a big thing. Again, going once again to the background, if you're lucky enough to find one or two hero props, finding weapons, finding military insignias, people actively collect that, and there's a big community of stuff to find that. And recreating it is made a little easier because there are so many actual examples. But when you get into the background, I'm sure in Oppenheimer there's a scene where there's people walking in and out of an office, people carrying coffee cups, people carrying briefcases, people with their pens. Every one of those had to be period correct. And as much effort goes into something that's third tier background as it was getting any of the hero props. And like I said, it's the scope. If there's an Oscar given to a movie, if I was a judge, one of the things that I would be looking at was just the scope of the amount of work that it took to pull this off. When you look at Barbie, part of the reason that the production designer got such praise was they created a whole world. They created all of these sets that looked like they would have existed in Barbie land. So when Guillaume did Oppenheimer, he had to create an entire world. And it was equally as impressive as anything that the production designer on Barbie did, and will never be given nearly the praise outside of these walls anyway.
Well, Guillaume, I'm pulling for you. Congrats again on your nomination. At least within these walls, as Scott said, we're recognizing the work. The last film on our list is Poor Things, Property Master Blaz Kovacs.
Yeah, this one was done primarily in Hungary. So once again, an interesting aspect of the whole property master thing is that this craft and this group of humans are now all over the world doing it at a very high level. And this is kind of a coming out party for Hungary, doing a film that's nominated as it has been, not just for production design, but for Best Picture as well. And they once again created an entire world, a semi-disturbing world if you're familiar with the story and the reason that this woman exists. It's pretty crazy story, but still the medical devices and the Frankenstein-esque vibe and environment they had to create. It was really gorgeous. Some of the autopsies and things they were doing early on, it kind of reminded me very much of early medicine going back to the early 19th century, but it had a very kind of like a Frankenstein macabre kind of vibe to it. Visually, this film really blew me away.
This movie has so many of the elements of the other movies. Like the creator, it was creating things that don't exist, but then just like Napoleon, there were certain elements of the past. Everything wasn't fantasy, but it was that perfect mix. And that even fantasy items, if it was medical equipment and they were making medical equipment that didn't exist, it still had to look like medical equipment that could have been made in this time period. So here you're having, I'm sure there was those arguments of, well, it wouldn't have opened this way because these kind of hinges didn't come about for another 100 years. And the movie just looked like a real world. It had that certain kind of Tim Burton feel where an entire world is created, but again, it needed consistency for it to work. The movie never felt like it just grabbed things and just said, good enough.
Yeah, and the interesting thing from an acting perspective, a lot of talent these days are method actors. So it's not just a matter of them hitting the marks and saying the lines, having read the script. They, for almost the entire production, become this character. So much of the job that a property master, art department, decorator does is to give them everything to be in this environment as much as possible. So their performance can actually come across on screen to the highest possible level. So some things that don't even ultimately end up on camera because it was just off camera, it was created and done and made. So all the people, background and the primary talent are in this environment the entire time. And then they capture it on film, and then it's greatly enhanced by CGI and the work that was done for Poor Things specifically.
Poor Things to me was just such an art piece. I remember at first and I saw it right when it came out, just from the coming attractions and the poster, I was thinking it was going to be a little too art house at times. And I was gonna just not enjoy it as much as I did. But it ended up being maybe one of my favorite movies of the year. And again, just the propping of it, from umbrellas to medical instruments to everything just having to just gel so perfectly. And Skid, when you were asking me some of my choices for movies, that's one of the things. This movie had the scope of lots of props. It had to create some things that really did exist in the past. Then it had to create a bunch of fictional fantasy items, but it had to have those fantasy items make sense with the real items from the past. And everything had to come off perfectly. And there's what Greg had said earlier. Never was I taken out of the movie and feeling like I wasn't in this environment.
Yeah, and exactly the opposite. There were moments where I was somewhat disturbed with the environment that I was in,
Right.
with just the things that were going on. But that's also part of what I love. I went into this film having no idea what I was sitting in the theater for. So it all just kind of presented itself, and it was so fresh and different. And all these other projects that we've seen, with really the exception of the creator, these were environments that in some capacity previously existed. This whole thing was created, this whole world, this whole idea was created from scratch. And there are very few stories that are done that way anymore. It's almost always a recreation of something that had previously existed, or a story that we've all seen parts of. This was pretty refreshing and pretty unique, like nothing you've ever seen before. There are very few films I could compare this to.
What's great about these kind of movies, and I would compare this with the creator again to fantasy kind of movies, just like an orchestra. If somebody is playing out of tune, even if you're not a musician, and they're playing slightly out of tune, slightly out of time, you might not know what's wrong, but something is going to give you an unbearable headache, and you're going to leave the auditorium just saying it just didn't work. And with a movie like this, especially with Poor Things, it really is like an orchestra, because the medical instruments, the fantasy element of those, have to work with the fantasy element of the costumes. There has to be a certain consistency that looks like they were all purchased on the same planet. And if the costume designer looks like they're going on Jupiter and the prop master is on Mars, you're going to leave with a headache. And everything just worked perfectly in tune with this. And the movie, to me, was just a beautiful art piece. And Guillaume had nothing to do with it.
It's funny you would say you knew Guillaume from Swordfish, and Doug Harlocker is a property master that's kind of, I won't say GOAT, because not everybody understands what that means and everybody will have a different opinion, but he's certainly one of the top 5 property masters that ever existed. Doug Harlocker is amazing, and so many really good property masters have worked under him. And Doug is still propping shows. He just finished up Dune 2, which is coming out in a few weeks, so I can hardly wait for that.
I didn't know he was working on Dune too. Wow, that's great as well. Yeah, it's all of these 5 films, again, really interesting ones though. Now we chose these to talk about, and going deeper has been a lot of fun. Do you want to mention any other films that were right on the edge of a nomination?
Yeah, I have a few, and it's kind of crossing a little bit of a line that is weird for a lot of people, but not everything these days is seen in a theater. So they don't necessarily qualify for an Oscar per se, but there's 5 projects in general that I thought were amazing. Barbie wasn't spoke about. I thought it was amazing look. But Asteroid City was another Wes Anderson film. Sandy Hamilton was the property master in that. They created this amazing, beautiful world. But 3 TV shows, all period, all done incredibly well, is Julia, the woman who brought cooking into our homes. Every scene in that involves props and food, and anybody that's done food on TV or on films, it can be a giant pain in the ass, and it has to be done really well. That was done amazing, with all the period stuff being completely spot on. The Gilded Age, same thing. Time period, turn of the century, super high end, absolutely gorgeous. Pete Clark did an amazing job in New York on that project. And then one of my favorite projects this year for everything combined was lessons in chemistry. It was a period thing, also on cooking and a scientific element. I just thought they nailed it across the board. The property master was Jody Mann, and the decorator was Laurie Mazur. And it was just, for me, amazing. And Dune 2 we'll be talking about next year, Doug Harlocker. That's another really cool one.
Scott, how about you? Anything else that was right on the edge of a nomination? Any other shout outs?
I'm trying to just look through. I see so many movies. I'm trying to look through different movies that I have seen this year.
While he's thinking of this, I'll throw in one more, and you can never discount what the Marvel world has brought us, because it's always super intense on the prop side of things, and what Russell Bobbitt and guys like Drew Petrata have done on big projects like Superman and Guardians of the Galaxy, and bringing that comic book world into our lives and recreating all these really cool things is pretty phenomenal.
All of the movies that I'm stopping on are movies like Priscilla. Any of the period films are the movies that always catch my attention, and they're always the movies that not only do I seek them out, they're always the movies that there's so many of these that I wish I had worked on, and I look at it, and not saying that I would do it any better or differently, just I would have loved to have had the experience. And it's, the Martin Scorsese movie, the Flower Moon.
Killers of the Flower Moon.
Killers of the Flower Moon. Just gorgeous. Just absolutely loved it. And it's the kind of thing that if I bumped into the prop master at ISS, I would shake his hand and say, so well done.
Well, Matt Cavallero is doing a Paul Thomas Anderson film right now, and he did Flowers of the Killer Moon and did an amazing job on that.
Well, respect for the work, guys. On that note, we're going to call it a wrap. Great having you both here. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. You'll find my contact info at our website, belowtheline.biz. That's B-I-Z. 12 episodes of Oscar Insights. That's a wrap on our Academy Awards coverage for the year. And I hope you've been entertained. I haven't committed yet to a release date for the next season, but I do have some fun episodes in the queue. So please subscribe if you haven't already. Closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. To all of our listeners, I appreciate you. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line.